Hey there everyone, welcome to Succinct Psychology. My name is Jai Hendrickson, and today I'm going to be going over the Introduction to Psychology, Chapter 1, test questions 1 through 47, odd numbers only. So without further ado, let's begin. Alright, which choice is an accurate definition of a hypothesis? A, an idea that proves a theory. B, a means of explaining social phenomena. C, a way of looking at the world. Or D, a tentative explanation. All right, give you a second to think about that. So an accurate definition of a hypothesis. You guys think. All right, well, if you guessed D, a tentative explanation, you guessed right. Alright, which of the following choices refers to a broad explanation or group of explanations for some aspect of the natural world that is consistently supported by evidence over time? We have A, critical thinking, B, hypothesis, C, statistical validation, or D, scientific theory. Well, we just went over what the definition of a hypothesis was, so we know it's not that. You are using a little bit of critical thinking right now, but it's probably not that either. So let's see, we're thinking of a group of explanations or a broad explanation for some aspect of the natural world. Does that sound like a statistical validation? Not so much. So if you guessed or chose D, scientific theory, you chose right. All right, which of the following exemplifies the empirical method? A, a student in a psychology class writes his term paper on whether or not fish feel pain. B, a student writes a letter to his professor requesting a change in course policy. C, Dr. Sarkeesian observes and records how watching cartoons influences heart rate. Or D, Dr. Isaac Witham decides to start her course later because so many students arrive late. Alright, this is a little loaded. Answer choices are a bit longer, so let's think about this. Exemplifies the empirical method. So we got a student in psychology class writing about his term paper. Student writes a letter. Dr. Sarkeesian observes and records. And Dr. Isaac Witham decides to start a course later. Well, if you chose C, Dr. Sarkeesian observes and records how watching cartoon influences heart rates, you chose correct. Alright, introspection refers to a process by which someone examines blank as objectively as possible. A, another person's consciousness. B, her own conscious experience. C, her own unconscious wishes. Or D, the social construction of consciousness. Alright, so introspection, objectively as possible. Well, intro, let's see. Intro sounds like in, since out is out. So if you chose B, her own conscious experience, you would be right. Introspection is when someone examines their own conscious experiences as objectively as possible. Alright, which of the following is a criticism of structuralism? A, scientific instruments were not sensitive enough to measure precise reaction times. B, structuralism was parsimonious. C, the process was highly subjective. Or D, Wilhelm Wundt falsified his results. Alright, criticism of structuralism. Give you a second to think about that. Alright, if you chose the process was highly subjective, you chose correctly. That was a big criticism of structuralism. There was a highly subjective process involved in structuralism. Alright, which of the following is an example of an objective measure used by functionalists? A, examination of anatomy and physiology. B, examination of existing archives and records. C, the use of introspection of one's own experience. Or D, interviews with research participants. All right. An example of an objective measure used by functionalists. Well, we just talked about introspection for structuralism, so probably not that one. If you chose A, examination of anatomy and physiology, you chose correct. Examining anatomy and physiology is obviously a highly objective way of measuring something. Alright, A and blank, also known as an operant chamber, is an instrument that isolates an animal from the external environment and allows a researcher to control that animal's rewards and punishments. We have A, a Gestalt room, B, an isolation chamber, C, a Skinner box, or D, a Watson manipulator. Alright, let's think about this. So, also known as an operant chamber, deals with animals and rewards and punishments. So, sounds like we're dealing with behaviorism here. And an operant chamber, there's also operant conditioning, which deals with behaviorism as well. And if you know anything about operant conditioning, then you know that that was a big process of B.F. Skinner. And so the answer would be C, Skinner box. If you chose that, good job. Alright. Behaviorism focuses on making psychology an objective science by A, studying how emotional responses influence behavior while de-emphasizing the importance of the subconscious. B, studying overt behavior and de-emphasizing the importance of unobservable mental processes. C, studying implicit motivations for behavior through the use of implicit association test. Or D, studying the genetic basis for behavior and theorizing how instincts influence behavior. Alright, so behaviorism and objective. Those are the two biggest words in that question. Let's see, so studying emotional responses, that doesn't sound very objective, so probably not A. Studying the genetic basis for behavior and theorizing how instincts influence behavior. If you chose B, studying overt behavior and de-emphasizing the importance of unobservable mental processes, you chose right. B. Alright. For which concept is Abraham Maslow best known? Classical conditioning of non-human animals. B, dream analysis for the latent and manifest content of a dream. C, proposing a hierarchy of human needs and motivating behavior. Or D, studying the influence of reinforcement and punishment on behavior. Okay, so D, we just went over reinforcement and punishment. That was a thing of B.F. Skinner as he dealt with animals. So probably not that one. And what do we know about Abraham Maslow? We know that he was a humanist. So classical conditioning of non-human animals, that wouldn't apply either in option A. Dream analysis for the latent and manifest content of a dream. Well, that sounds like a psychoanalysis. So we're left with C. Proposing a hierarchy of human needs and motivating behavior. And as you can see, human needs, that has to do with humanism, which is what Abraham Maslow was. He was a humanist. So the answer is C. Alright, which of the following exemplifies the unconditional positive regard component of client-centered therapy? A, Abby tells her therapist that she tripped a small child who got in her way, and her therapist accepts this information without judgment. B, Boris tells his therapist that he needs stronger medication and his therapist prescribes it. C, Natasha is late for her therapy session, and her therapist believes she did this because she unconsciously dislikes therapy. Or D, Xavier receives a hug from the doctor when he arrives on time. He does not get a hug when he arrives late. Alright, let's pick apart this question here, see what we have. So, unconditional positive regard, client-centered therapy. Well, that already sounds like humanism. Okay, so we know we're dealing with humanism here. And the big thing here to look at is the unconditional positive regard component. So which one of these sounds like it's unconditional positive regard? D says he does not get a hug when he arrives late, so that doesn't sound like unconditional positive regard. Natasha's late for a therapy session, so her therapist thinks she did it because she unconsciously dislikes therapy. That also does not sound like unconditional positive regard. And Boris tells his therapist that he needs stronger medication and his therapist prescribes it. Well, maybe it can be unconditional positive regard, but not so much. A, Abby tells her therapist that she tripped a small child who got in her way, and her therapist accepts this information without judgment. Well, that sounds like unconditional positive regard, and that is the answer, A. Alright. Select the correctly ordered list of psychological perspectives with the earliest perspective listed first. We have option A, humanism, behaviorism, structuralism, functionalism. B, humanism, structuralism, functionalism, behaviorism. C, structuralism, functionalism, behaviorism, humanism. Or D, structuralism, functionalism, humanism, behaviorism. Alright, well, I'm going to give you a hint. Humanism did not come first, so now we're left with options C and D. So structuralism, functionalism, those both come. So which one came first, behaviorism or humanism? So we know behaviorism was related to Watson, Pavlov, B.F. Skinner, and humanism was related to Maslow and Carl Rogers. And if you guessed C, you guessed right. B.F. Skinner and the behaviorist came before the humanist. And C is the correct option. Alright, which of the following is not part of feminist psychology? A, discovering the contributions of women to psychology. B, favoring women over men. C, questioning the practice of science itself when it is male biased. Or D, studying psychological gender differences. Alright, so which is not part of feminist psychology? Well, A, discovering the contributions of women to psychology, that sounds like something that would fall within the realm of feminist psychology, and it does. Questioning the practice of science itself when it is male biased, that also sounds like part of feminist psychology, and it is. And then studying psychological gender differences is also part of feminist psychology. Therefore, the answer is B, favoring women over men. That is not part of feminist psychology. Alright. In looking at the area of multicultural psychology, what is a recognized deficit of this particular area of study? We have A, it can describe what happens between cultures, but not explain why those differences occur. B, it ignores the relative importance of white psychologists to the larger field. C, it is biased by serious political agendas among its researchers. Or D, there are not enough non-white researchers engaged in data collection. Alright, this one's a little loaded, so I'll give you a second to think about that. A recognized deficit of multicultural psychology. Alright, if you guessed A, it can describe what happens between cultures but not explain why those differences occur, you chose right. It is A. Alright. Penelope studies how the structure and function of the nervous system is related to behavior. She is a biopsychologist, B, developmental psychologist, C, humanist, or D, social psychologist. Alright, well, let's start from the bottom. So social psychologists, they deal with social interactions between people. So there's always when it's a group thing or more than one interactions. Humanists are more client-centered therapy for one-on-one things. Developmental is studying infancy to adolescence and the cognitive process in between that. And so we're left with biopsychologists, and that would be the correct answer because they would study the structure of the function of the nervous system and how that relates to behavior. Okay, what should be changed to make the following statement true? Jean Piaget is famous for his theories regarding changes in emotional ability that occur as we move from infancy to adulthood. We have option A, the word famous should be changed to the word infamous. B, the word infancy should be changed to the word adolescence. C, the word emotional should be changed to the word cognitive. And D, the name Jean Piaget should be changed to Abraham Maslow. Okay, well, from the top, it was a famous theory. It was not infamous, so no, it's not that. And I did just say that it was a study of infancy to adolescence, so we're not changing that either. And this was a theory of Jean Piaget, so we're not going to change it to Abraham Maslow. Therefore, we're left with option C. The word emotional should be changed to the word cognitive. Because Jean Piaget, he studied the emotional ability that occurs as we move from infancy to adulthood, not the emotional. Or the cognitive, correction, not the emotional. So answer C is the correct option. Alright, cognitive psychology focuses on studying A, genetics and the effect of genetics on behavior, B, sensation and the effect of culture on perception, C, the effect of gender, race, and class on behavior, or D, thoughts and their relationship to our experiences and our actions. Alright, let's see, genetics and the effect of genetics on behavior. That sounds kind of like a biopsychologist. Sensation and the effect of culture on perception. Well, that's sensation and perception psychology. The effect of gender, race, and class on behavior. Well, that can probably fall within a few different ones, maybe health or social psychology. So we're left with D, thoughts and the relationship to our experiences and our actions. And that would be the correct option. All right. Edmund wants to identify relatively consistent patterns of thought and behavior, measure these traits, and determine how these traits interact in a particular context to determine how a person will behave in any given situation. Edmund wants to conduct research in the area of A, cognition, B, perception, C, personality, or D, social psychology. All right, well, this is a pretty loaded question, so let's look at this here and see if we can identify any things. So, relatively consistent patterns of thoughts and behavior, that's one thing we need to look at. Let's see, and how these traits interact in a particular context to determine how a person will behave in any given situation. Well, we just discussed what cognition was, and that was how thoughts relate to behavior. And perception, is that perception? We're talking about consistent patterns of thought and behavior, so that does sound like personality. So if you chose C, personality, you chose correct. All right. Susan wants to study prejudice, attraction, how we explain our own behavior versus how we explain the behavior of others, and how we resolve interpersonal conflicts. Susan should conduct research in the area of A, Gestalt psychology, B, personality, C, psychoanalysis, or D, social psychology. Well, we just went over what personality psychology was, so we know it's not that. And we're talking about prejudice, attraction, how we explain our own behavior versus how we explain the behavior of others, and how we resolve interpersonal conflicts. So those all have to do with people interacting with other people. And we know that the psychological perspective that uses that is social psychology. And so that would be choice D. All right, which of the following is an example of research someone might conduct in the area of health psychology? We have option A, how the age of a leader affects the productivity of the group. B, whether people working at a desk are more likely to be obese. C, whether culture influences perception. Or D, what personality traits are present more often in men compared to women? Okay, well, D already sounds like it's dealing with personality psychology, so probably not that. And then whether cultures influence perception, well, that doesn't sound like it has anything to do with health, so probably not that either. And then option A says how the age of a leader affects the productivity of the group. That also sounds like it has nothing to do with health, because it does not. So we're left with option B, which has the word obese, which does have to do with health. So whether people working at a desk are more likely to be obese. That is the correct option. B. All right. Which kind of psychologist would be consulted in jury selection and witness preparation? We have option A, cognitive, option B, counseling, option C, forensic, and option D, legal. Okay, so dealing with jury and witness protection. So we can already see that it's probably not cognitive and it's probably not counseling, because either of those have anything to do with jury selection or witness protection. So we're left with forensic and legal. Well, the intuitive answer would be to choose D, legal, because those all fall within the legal realm. But the correct answer is actually C, forensic. A forensic psychologist would be the one to be consulted in jury selection and witness protection, witness preparation. All right. Dr. Singh has just completed her PhD program and is now applying for a year-long program at a nationally recognized hospital. If accepted, she will greatly advance her knowledge of behavioral neuroscience. Dr. Singh is applying for a blank training program. A, fellows. B, applied. C, psychiatric. Or D, postdoctoral. Okay, so this is a bit of a loaded question as well. So let's see what we can find in here that might help us out. Okay, so she just completed her PhD program. Okay, and we know a PhD is a doctorate. So put those two together. She just completed her doctorate. Post does mean after, so postdoctoral. So if you chose answer D, you chose right. All right, now for a couple of short answer questions. First one's going to be, this student of Wilhelm Wundt developed Wundt's ideas into an area called structuralism, a field that focused on understanding the contents rather than the function of mental processes. Okay, so this is a student, a pupil of Wilhelm Wundt, and he actually turned Wundt's ideas into what would be known as structuralism. So I'll give you a second to think about this. Can't really give you any hints. All the hints are given in the question. He was a pupil of Wilhelm Wundt, and he turned his ideas into what would be known as structuralism. All right. Well, if you decided on Titchener, you would be correct. Edward Titchener was his student and pupil that turned his ideas into structuralism. All right. What three features are central to Carl Rogers' client-centered therapy? Let's think about this. So, okay, Carl Rogers, client-centered therapy. So we know we're dealing with humanism because Carl Rogers was a humanist and client-centered therapy is the hallmark of humanism. So what are the three central features of humanism? Well, we discussed one already not too long ago. I'll give you that one. It is unconditional positive regard. So that's the first and one of the biggest ones of humanism. So we have two more. I'll let you think about that for a second. It's similar to unconditional positive regard. They're words that describe something that falls within the realm. So if you thought it was empathy and genuineness, you are right. It is unconditional positive regard, empathy, and genuineness. And for our final question, why are the 5 trait dimensions in the 5-factor model used to account for personality variation? Okay, so this one's a bit loaded as well. Okay, so we're dealing with the 5 trait dimensions in the 5-factor model, and we want to know why they're used to account for personality variation. Okay, well, let's think of the 5 traits first. So a good way I like to do it is I use the acronym OCEAN. Openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, neuroticism. Okay, so we're dealing with those 5 traits. Why would we be using those to account for personality variation? Well, what else do we know about the five traits? Well, the biggest thing is that they're relatively stable over their lifespan. So maybe the dimensions of conscientiousness, agreeableness, neuroticism, openness, and extroversion are used to account for personality variation because they have been demonstrated to be relatively stable over the lifespan and they're influenced by genetics. So what you need to remember is that they're going to be relatively stable over time, and that's the biggest thing. That's why they're used to account for personality variation. All right, everyone. That concludes Chapter 1 of Introduction to Psychology, test questions 1 through 47. Odd numbers only. I hope you learned a thing or two, and I hope to see you next time.